Hi, I'm your host, Peter Sawchuk. I'm a professor of adult education and workplace learning at the University of Toronto. On this episode of Work Learning and Social Change Emerging Voices, we hear from Asmita Bhutani, a doctoral researcher at the University of Toronto studying platform technology, work, and learning. Welcome, everybody, to this episode of the Work Learning and Social Change Emerging Voices. It's an informal discussion series focusing on up-and-coming researchers, people who are going to, in time, I think, shape the field. It's designed to expand the audience's thinking about the field of study by taking a close look at the application of a theory to new and sometimes persisting problems, sometimes taking a look at old problems in new ways, new problems in old ways, or some combination there. It's informal. And let me get on to introduce our guest today. So I'm really pleased to welcome Asmita Bhutani. She is a PhD student in the Adult Education and Community Development Program at the University of Toronto, Canada. She's a fellow at the University of Toronto Schwartz Reisman Institute of Technology and Society. And she holds I'm going to exhaust myself with all these things that she holds, and she holds a Canadian Social Science and Humanities Research Council graduate scholarship. Prior to beginning her PhD, she worked in the area of adult education and workplace learning with nonprofits and in community settings in India as well as Canada. Her PhD dissertation aims to explore the gendered and racialized labor processes of platform-based services work in the global South. She's also helped to lead the Researching Work and Learning International Conference Series event, RWL 12, being organized out of Toronto, Canada. So that's the formal introduction of my guest. Asmita, it's great to see you, and thanks for taking time out of your afternoon to contribute to the Work Learning, Social Change, Emerging Voices series. What's it feel like to be an emerging voice, and how are you?
Sure, it's a pleasure. Happy to be here. It feels great. I'm so glad that you've started something like this. I think it's going to be really helpful to folks like me who get to speak about emerging forms of work and learning, but also to those who are listening and who are researching and have their scholarship in this area.
Yeah, I mean, it's going to be helpful for others new ideas sometimes come from old voices, established voices. They often come from emerging ones. So I think people are going to learn a lot from this. So I'm just going to jump into my first question. Is that okay?
Yeah, for sure.
Okay, good. Okay, so I'm going to read right from my notes here. Can you tell us more about yourself and your background, specifically in terms of how you arrived at and began to focus on this question of platforms, platform economics, work and learning, and what are platforms? How did you arrive at this topic area?
That's a lot of questions together, but I think it's kind of tough to do an epistemological analysis of how I landed into this, because I was a teacher when I started out, and then a workplace learning facilitator, mainly in nonprofits, digitizing the curriculum and making modules and those kind of things, and then an adult educator in public and private sort of setups. So I've lived a life of precarity, I guess, and moved on too many jobs because I could just either not stand the employer or the way things were at the workplace. But overall, I think capitalist notions of development and progress, I find disturbing, because they're not just notions, right? They impact people's daily lives, and they don't always state whose development are we talking about. And you can see it in micro levels when promotions and getting more material benefits in workplaces is considered a good thing, but they may very well be a strategy for control. Or even at macro levels where land and labor is expropriated in the name of larger goals of everyone's good to keep everyone fed and keep the capitalist wheel running. My master's thesis was, in fact, on exploitation and violence, and mostly against women, and how that is very much an imminent part of accumulating capital through development projects and infrastructure, mining, and so on. And And championing progress at this point is this move towards digitization of everything, right? Building towards an automated future, not just flying cars or robotics or those kind of things, which are very much failing, by the way, but even digitizing sort of citizenship identities for the purpose of, let's say, voting, or even automation in admin tasks to cut the boring, redundant parts of work. And all this has been has come to be termed as the fourth industrial revolution, right? And digital platforms are a big part of this. And on the other hand, so this was something that I was experiencing reading, but on the other hand, we also see all these reports of Uber drivers or food delivery workers who get paid below minimum wage. It's barely enough for them to survive. And women experiencing sexual violence when they go for food deliveries, or even being deactivated from the platform because they got a low rating for not smiling enough, right, with their customer. But they had no way of complaining because there was no manager and they were not even employees. And so I started looking into platforms, which is when I realized that this is bigger than Uber and Foodora. Platforms are not limited to the gig economy or the precarious sort of economy. And they're causing some fundamental changes to the labor process, how we perceive of resistance, how we think of traditional workplaces. So yeah, all of that. And about what platforms are, because I think we're going to say the word many, many times today. So, there are these computerized coded systems which run on the internet, right? And sometimes without it, but mostly on the internet, mediating different entities, whether it's service providers or advertisers or consumers, sellers, and sometimes even workers. And one aspect of its ability to provide its ability to provide a very easy and convenient way to generate data and extract data and monopolize data. And in that, their infrastructures, right? So Uber as a platform operates, it generates traffic data, it generates activity of the data of the activity of drivers and the riders. And then the data helps attract more customers and more riders and increase its usage, and then so on. So increasingly, there's monopolization within the sector, and that's pretty much how all of these platforms operate. But I'll just add that while Uber is the most obvious visible platform and its workers are the most obvious visible platform workers, and a whole lot of scholarship has revolved around Uber, it's also called Uberization of the platform work scholarship. But the fact is that increasingly there is an imperative to platformize all sorts of labor processes. And what that means is not directly, is not necessarily changing the task itself, right? Like a driver is a driver and still doing the same thing about taking a person from one point to the other. So which was very well done through the taxis as well. But one of the other aspects of platforms is that the relations within the labor process are transformed, because now platform becomes your manager. It coordinates tasks for you. It coordinates the workers. It becomes an instrument of control. It decides wages, incentives, and puts chatbots for worker grievances, for which traditionally you would have just walked into the manager's door, or do all those workplace resistance tactics, agitate and organize. And so that's a pretty big change in the way we understand, or we've understood so far, work, worker, technology, relationships, workplace culture, or even labor laws are all based on that traditional sort of understanding. So a lot of mystification there, and my current work is particularly about platforms that coordinate large amount of labor globally and who do all the data work that powers automated machines and softwares. So yeah, a very long answer, but that's what it is.
No, it was far from mystifying. It was totally demystifying for me. I mean, I've studied technology and technological change a lot over my career. And I don't know if you feel the same way, but there's something recognizable and old to what's these new dynamics, and then something fundamentally different. And you summarize some of those things there. It does seem to me like there's a, I guess the $10 phrase would be there's a quantitative change that leads to a qualitative change, like something that really does function differently in this platform economics versus, just automated production service, or, McDonald's, pretty automated place in a way. But this does seem different to what you're talking about. And the infusion of the technology deeper into more and more of the crevices of human interaction. And it's fascinating what you said about also this question of resistance, infusion into the possibilities, and then the tactics and responses of resistance for labor. This is fascinating, I think. Let me ask you a second question, more specifically about how you want to go. I mean, you've given a bunch of clues, more than clues, about how you want to understand, like, your theoretical approach. So you're going to have you're going to be analyzing data on this. What kind of theories are you using? You've mentioned labor process a little bit, but there's other theories too, since you're talking about kind of a global gendered and racialized dynamics. There's this kind of specter of precarity. Anyways, so how do you understand your analytic or your theoretical approach to analyzing and penetrating this kind of problem that you sketched really well, I thought? Yeah. What's your theoretical approach?
So there are multiple sort of analytical cuts which I perceive that I need to make in order to make sense of this, like I said, very mystified phenomenon, and my quest to constantly sort of de-obfuscate it, if that's a word. But I think the first thing which has guided me now, as well as in my master's thesis, is a historical materialist sort of an approach. One that helps in understanding that platforms as technologies are not, a product of some bunch of people who sat in a room and thought of this innovative idea, but that it is a response to the economic conditions, such as decreasing productivity and economic crisis of the 80s, 90s in the US, or even political conditions in that the state, the law supported such massive investment into what further brought the dot-com boom, and then even and continues to fuel automation materially, right? And so Nick Chernicek is somebody who wrote a book called Platform Capitalism. It gives a really good account of this evolution, not so much the revolution, but how this evolves. So that has really helped me. And then finding out what's behind these supposedly opaque platforms, right? They've also been termed black boxes, because you really don't know how it operates, what algorithm runs when, and why does somebody else get more wage than me, and how's that person selected before me to onboard the platform, and why am I deactivated? So all of those things are pretty much a mystery, unless, of course, somebody really engages with them, which is the worker, and I can talk about it later, but they have figured out some forms of, hacking the algorithm and then using it to their advantages and stuff. But anyway, like, what are the relations behind these platforms? How do platform companies operate at this point? At this point, what they do is that we are not employers. We're just platform providers. The relation is between the worker and the consumer. So for me, and for anyone concerned with how work works, this obfuscation is very unsettling. And labor process theory has a long tradition of unpacking these kind of relations, right? What's happening on the shop floor. So I do go back to Braverman and Baravoy and such. But then these theories have also been criticized, especially by Marxist feminists, for not paying adequate attention to patriarchal relations at work and how they are fundamental to the way power relations are maintained. And so how do women workers particularly navigate through these technologies in a lot of online platforms, especially when home is the site of production? Right, because this is happening in a freelance way, and where the platform is your boss, then we need to sort of look at how feminism has historically understood gendered subjectivities in the production process, including home-based work, or even the way material conditions like access to work, the pay one gets, the digital training one needs to be able to navigate through these platforms. So how those processes can be very gendered. So that's one lens. The other analytic is the global chains of production, sort of bringing that into the picture, because that provides a way to understand the racial and gender divisions of labor in this work. So all of the companies, the major companies that actually own platforms are either in US, UK, Canada, China, and a majority of workers, if we talk specifically about gig work, then workers are mostly racialized and are migrants, right? Whether in global north or south, if I know those categories are controversial, but for the purposes of geographical sort of distinction at this point. And in case of hyper online platform work, such as crowd work, content moderation, you know how on social media you don't see violent images and violent videos, that's because somebody sitting somewhere has sifted it out for you and watched them at length and decided that these are violent. And so these workers are mostly in India, Philippines, and Latin America. So there's a very clear sort of division here, and also very elongated sort of transnational chain. And again, it's not new, right? Like low wage or unpaid work has always used logics of racism and gender segregation and divisions. But you see platforms mask that relationship very successfully and turn the gaze on the worker, right? That their flexibility, they're being tech savvy, they're being independent earners, and they're liberated from the traditional work arrangements, so they have more sort of power to make their own decisions when it comes to their work lives. And I think to understand the morphing of learning and work currently with increasingly longer transnational chains, the new international division of labor literature is very useful. It's not exactly being applied directly to platform work, but it does exist in other kinds of transnational works. What else? Also political organizing, right? One of the advantages I think that capitalism did give was the factory, where workers could collect together and classes were demarcated, not out of its own goodness of the heart, but because this way workers' power was easier to suppress for them, right? But then what also happened is greater union movements came out of it, a sharing of professional identity and worker identities came out of it. But with platforms, these lines are blurred and control has been more sort of localized, individualized from your screen, you know, your desktop. And of course, also fading away of who the manager is, which I've spoken about a couple of times. And then, so it is important for us to understand what platforms and this kind of work means for political organizing. Because if we consider strictly platform mediated work, such as Uber, food delivery platforms, crowd work platforms, these workers are spatially dispersed, right? They're not part of the same kind of company or sector. So platform workers are of all kinds in all sectors. And trade unions also currently struggle to even just simply gather these workers because they work in such fragmented settings and across industries. And then another thing is that the workers do not identify as workers. They identify themselves as entrepreneurs and independent contractors. So it disrupts the traditional mode of worker organizing. So that's another sort of lens for me to investigate as to where that goes and how do we make sense of it.
Oh, yeah. Boy, there's a ton there. Wow, that's, and you know, and every time you talked about, you know, these kind of ways on immediate scale, shaping of experiences, and then also shaping of perspectives and perception, and this business about who identity essentially gets blurred around this question of whether you're a worker or whether you're a business owner, an entrepreneur or something. And all these, I get to thinking about how it changes the consciousness and perception, and hence the kind of learning and development and pathways forward through this new world. It's fascinating stuff. Now, I want to ask you, because I came to, I want to ask you like another question. I came to, I'd read a little bit on gig economy stuff, and there's mention of platforms. But then when I started reading your work, I said, wow, I didn't know there was this, this burgeoning field of platform economic discussions. So then I started reading some of this stuff. I found it really helpful. Now, in terms of one of your recent publications, now this is entitled, I want to get the title exactly right here, Global Implications for Work-Based Lifelong Learning in Platform Economies. And this is for our Springer handbook of, I think it was Handbook of Lifelong Learning publication. Now, I think this summarizes a lot. You're going a good deal further with this, but just in this conversation. But can you talk about some of the takeaways of that thing? Because that's going to probably be available to people at the same time, roughly this online video is available to people. Can you maybe speak to that? I hear a lot of the basic ideas, not so basic ideas, but the ideas you've been talking about as connected closely to that. Can you speak to that publication in terms of like key takeaways around how you've gone about researching kind of work and learning in this context?
Yeah, it was great writing this chapter with you, Peter. And yeah, I can definitely talk about the key takeaways, and probably you can talk a little bit about it too, as to what you think are the insights people will be interested in. And also the two very different labor market contexts that we could bring into interaction, right? To understand that platform economy is not a monolith, that all platform economy is not gig economy. And in that, it makes a shift from the Uberization of this literature. And it helps drive the point, I think, which is a very important one, that tech by itself is not this thing, right? It is embedded in the social, political context, in the historical context of how labor struggles and state welfare impacts of how technology creeps into our work and learning context. Like on one hand, there's this highly regulated, supposedly secure employment relationship in care management platforms where nurses use that in Canada. And on the other, there is this precarious, deregulated, and ambiguous sort of employment relationship in data labeling work in India. And yet what is common is the platform technology. So that, I think, is one key point. And then workplace simultaneously as a site of labor and as a site of learning was something very key. So on one hand, we have aspects of labor process, such as control and skilling, which follow from Braverman's thesis and everybody who followed. But then within this labor process, workers develop learning processes, right? Knowledge and subjectivity, resistance, agency, and so on, decision-making and things like that. And that these processes are not separate. Right. So the analytic of labor process as a learning process becomes a very useful unit of analysis to understand platform work in its heterogeneous forms and contexts. The other key takeaway would be matters, what matters in discussions of lifelong learning currently, right? Or in workplace learning, in both scholarship and policies or political organizing. Not saying that platform economies is the only discussion that matters now, but the dominant discourse on technology and learning in these fields revolves around only a few threads at the moment, right? One is how we can make technologies better and accessible so that learning can be better, train adult educators accordingly, provide resources, and so on. And the other is how automation will take away our jobs, or will not take away our jobs because it needs humans in the loop and such. And in this chapter, we're saying, I think, that the obsession over future of work, in that obsession, we shouldn't ignore the present of how current moment is a key moment when capitalist technology is morphing. And we need some key analysis here. And then also for learning, it cannot be limited to whether we now have mastered the technology to tame it usefully or not, or skilling to become experts by completing XYZ modules and design frameworks and all that. But that how this technology is being built, what sorts of subjectivities is it building, right? And we talk about algorithmic subjectivities in the chapter. And even in skills, how they're actively learned in the workplace, that platforms are mediating this particular learning process. So yeah, those are some key takeaways, but also I'll say briefly about the methodology of this chapter in that describe.
Oh, can I stop it just because it, like, I mean, I think it was, I don't know that I ever read anything about this term algorithmic subjectivities before I basically was working with you and read your work. And that as a basis of the learning aspect of this very kind of personalized face of the labor learning process, I think is interesting. Now, you already do have another point you want to go into, but I wanted to ask you, do you, like, methodologically in your research, do you want to get at those types of, those are pretty, interiorized, I'm not saying that word very well, aspects of the learning and then personhood? Do you think you get at that, or have you been getting at that in your work? Because I know in the chapter that you and I did, it just wasn't the space to get into some of these details, but that's an interest of yours thing, because I find it fascinating.
Yeah, so there is already some research on how workers exercise algorithmic subjectivity. And again, that is in the context of Uber more than any other platform, where they would, trick the platform to take a different route and hence make more money, or want to get home early, or deactivate on purpose so that they can get more off time. And so those kind of things. Or also increase their chances at a wage and chances at being recruited. There was also this thing from Amazon, Mechanical Turk, which is pretty much a data labeling platform owned by Amazon, of course, where the workers were not working themselves, but they were outsourcing it to other workers by simply sharing the product code and those kind of things. Anyway, so I think it is possible to investigate that without being having like a full knowledge of how the technicalities of it, and without being an engineer, let's just say. It is possible because eventually you can investigate it from the point of view of the worker, right? How the workers are using it, how their daily lives are impacted by it. What is the role of algorithm versus the platform ecosystem itself? So I think I am that will be integral part. I don't see how I would not do it in order to understand how this works. So yeah.
Oh, nice. Wow. And that was another thing you said, the platform ecosystems. This is an expansive model. That's another great terminology that you've introduced to me anyways. I guess you say there's literature out there. I got to read more about it, I guess. I kind of interrupted you in the middle of your answer. Is there something you want to add to that business about takeaways, or something to do with that article or that chapter you were talking about, or did you cover all the things you wanted to start to say?
Yeah, just a brief point I wanted to make, but I do want to very quickly slip in the idea of ecosystem and why that's very important, because a lot of times platforms are understood as these sole sort of technologies that operate all by themselves. Which is not true, because there are data centers attached to it. There is a very material, expansive geographical structure attached to the functioning of any kind of platform, which is easily forgotten when we think of cloud computing or internet, and we think that they're somewhere in the cloud. We don't see them. They don't they're not real material. So that's not the case. Anyway, coming back to the chapter, I was just saying about the methodology that in describing case studies to both inform and further analytical insights, I think was a very useful strategy. And I had not used that before in writing papers and thinking about these things. And scholars and researchers do hold an interest in methodology. So I think this way of approaching the topic was useful. Even me without having entered the field as such, but looking at case studies, I think that was really, that was really useful. And because you also, I think in the question, there was this thing about, well, what is it that we would like workplace learning researchers and to think about. So apart from all of this, I think, and that probably will be my concluding stuff, but technology, I think, is too important for the society to be left to engineers and internet studies or something like that. It needs a socio-political, economic analysis from those who understand the labor processes and the learning processes. And I think definitely workplace learning scholars are uniquely positioned to see that relation, right? So I wish more and more people can get into this.
Now, you just tweaked something for me there, because I remember when I first got news that you were a fellow in the Schwartz-Reisman Institute. I'm forgetting the name right now, but it was part of your introduction there. And so is this bringing you kind of, into connection with some of the people who are more on the, like, I guess I'm imagining the tech, maybe even the engineering side, or is it people kind of more like yourself who are asking these kind of social questions? Because part of the name of the institute, I think, is Technology and Society. How has been the experience there for you?
Yeah, it's a small group of fellows, but the good thing is exactly what you said, that it does try and bring these two things together, right? So there are these people who are very computer sciencey, working on creating these algorithms and working on creating these platforms. And then there are these people, which are definitely less in number, who are then thinking, who are coming from a social sciences, humanities, education, those kind of fields, and saying that, hey, you also need to understand how this is impacting, or where is it leading as a society, and how it fits in the capitalist mode of production and what it is capable of doing. So yeah, that those meetings can get a little bit geeky at times. For me, like somebody giving a presentation on blockchain, and I'm like, I need to read up to just even understand what this means. But yeah, I think those interactions are important. But that said, interactions are not everything, because a lot of times universities and academia would, facilitate these interactions and be like, okay, we're done. We've facilitated. So that's only the beginning. I think there needs to be more work done together beyond scholarship, again, in the policy and the politics side of it, to actually get where we want to.
Well, I have a last question for you. I think we have a little more time. We have just enough time for it. Is just what is next? What do you plan to do next? What are your other projects possibly? I don't know everything that you're doing. I just know the little area that I've been reading on from your work. What's next for you? What else are you doing? What's next for you, scholarship-wise?
Yeah, no, I'm at this point very focused on just entering into the field and doing a critical ethnography. The pandemic is definitely, it's a disruptor to enter the field, and especially when my field is not based here, but I want to be going to India. So we'll see how that goes, but that's what my immediate next step is, focusing on doing my ethnography, looking at the everyday conditions of women workers on data annotation platforms and how these gendered relations work. But yeah, aside from that, no projects, nothing.
aside from all that. Yeah, right.
Yeah.
Well, it's great how you focus things. And I tell you, I've probably said it like 8 times already, but I learned so much from your work. Anyways, Asmita, thank you so much for taking the time to speak with me today. It's been an absolute pleasure. I always learn a little bit more every time I talk with you about your work. I think it's so important that people hear about specific projects, the application of what can seem like abstract ideas, because it helps guide them in any number of ways they want to apply a theory. And of course, they can also get, as I've started to do, get just completely enamored with the type of project that you're putting together and all this. Anyways, I think there's so much can be learned. And I really thank you for spending part of your afternoon with me here. I wish you all the best, and looking forward to speaking to you again soon. And goodbye. Thank you very, very much.
Thank you, Peter. This was excellent. Thank you. And I haven't said this so far, but a lot of my learning and literature has come from the workplace learning and social change class. An introduction to folks like Alessandro Gandini, who's written on gig economy and platforms and work and those kind of things. So thank you for this, and otherwise for the course as well. Thank you.
No problem. That was that source you just mentioned, Gandini, and you were my jumping off points on this question. I began to think differently about the research I've been doing in care work. So thank you for that. Anyways, I'll let you go. Very generous contribution, and great seeing you again. Bye-bye.